I wanted to build my grandparents something special for Christmas this year, so I decided to turn this lighthouse into a CNC wood project. The only problem was I just bought this CNC machine and barely knew how to use it. Also, I've never really worked with wood before, so naturally this seemed like a perfectly reasonable first project. Turns out it was a little harder than I expected, not impossible, just difficult and way too much sanding. The lighthouse I'm going to be making for them is the New Jersey Barnegat Lighthouse. It's a place that's meaningful to my family and holds a lot of special memories, especially to my grandparents. It's something I can pretty much guarantee they'll love, even if the execution ends up more looking like a stick figure sketch than an actual lighthouse. It won't come down to that, probably, but I'm really going to put some time and effort into the design, manufacturing, and finishing of this build. I use this image as a reference for the project. I decided not to include the gazebo as it's not really the focus of this build. Importantly, leaving it out massively cuts down on complexity and the overall build time. The lighthouse jetty concrete slabs will be the main features inside the frame, so using Fusion, I traced out the lighthouse and designed the frame. I then broke it into subsections for the workpiece so my CNC machine could actually machine them. The idea is to cut all the individual pieces and then assemble them later into the final project. I recently purchased this AVID CNC Benchtop Pro with a 24x24 workspace off Facebook Marketplace, and I've been slowly learning the capabilities of this machine. For the control software, I'm using Mach 3, so I'm pretty new to this CNCing stuff, so if you have any suggestions on how to improve some processes, please leave a comment down below. Here's where my ideas get shaped into reality. I'm running a 3D adaptive clearing path to remove the bulk of material, followed by a contour pass to cut out the outer profile. And then finally to finish it up using a parallel finishing path just to clean all those rough patches up. Each piece takes about 20 minutes to cut using fairly conservative feeds and speeds. Since I'm still dialing in the machine and have a limited supply of ideal wood for this project, I'm opting to take it slow so I don't ruin any parts. For tooling, I'm using a 1/4 inch flat end mill for the roughing passes and then switching it up to an 1/8 inch flat end mill for the finishing details. The frame is out of walnut, the top of the lighthouse is bloodwood, the base and stand area are out of soft maple, and the rocks are also out of walnut. I wanted the natural colors to contrast between the woods to do most of the visual work for me. One thing I would definitely put more thought into next time is how I separated the parts from the stock material. I didn't leave enough clearance between the part and the surrounding material, which made cutting them out more difficult than it needed to be. Because of that, it increased the risk that I could use too much force and end up damaging the final part, which I may or may not have done along the way. I'm really happy with how these pieces are coming along, especially with how much detail the CNC was able to capture in the wood. I think the woods I chose for this project will really help make the final piece pop. The contrasting colors and slightly raised layers should give a nice three-dimensional look once everything is assembled. That being said, cleaning up the rough edges and tooling marks from the machine is going to be incredibly tedious, especially with how some of these parts ended up being pretty thin. Off camera, I've already snapped 2 versions of the rock sections, just trying to cut it out of the stock material. I really don't want to redesign that section since it's pretty important to the overall build, so for this last one, I'm going to have to be very careful. I think the frame for this build turned out pretty well. The chamfer along the edges is clean and defined, and the engraving came out very sharp. A subtle detail that I think adds a nice touch and I'm sure my grandparents will love. That said, this part suffered from some pretty severe chattering during the milling process. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to leave some visible tool marks, which means I'll be spending a little bit extra time doing everyone's favorite activity. Yup, sanding. Most of the chatter probably came from being a little bit too aggressive with my feeds and speeds, combined with not having enough rigidity in the workpiece. I probably could have easily increased rigidity by adding a few more tabs, but hindsight's always 20/20. And here it is, a rough, very rough mock-up of the full project. Just needs some glue and a lot of sanding. But overall, I think it's coming together very well, even with a few hiccups along the way. Now that everything is cut and mocked up, it's time to slow things down and be a little bit more deliberate with my actions. Sanding isn't the most exciting part of this build, especially when it's mostly done by hand, but it's probably the most important part. This is where the rough pieces start to actually look and feel more like a finished product instead of some rough machine parts. Every surface has to be smooth to the touch, not just for appearance, but to give the glue a better bonding surface and remove the milling marks from earlier. Stain will highlight every imperfection as it soaks into the pores of the wood, bringing out details that dust and debris can hide. The CNC machine gets you close, and with better design it could have reduced a lot of the work, but when you're milling wood, sanding is pretty much always part of the process. Before final assembly, I jumped onto Onshape to quickly design and print a few jigs to help with alignment. The goal was to keep all the surface parallel while the glue dried. I also added some small ledges underneath so if any glue squeezed through the seams, it wouldn't bond to the table, as that would be a nightmare to take apart. In theory, it was a good idea, but in practice, the jigs didn't really work well for the smaller parts. Instead of popping out cleanly, the pieces would often stick to the jig walls, which meant I had to use some more force to break them free. Since there isn't that much surface area between most of these parts, using too much force would often just break the glue bond. So for smaller internal pieces, I ended up just holding them in place for a few minutes while the glue set. I worked in small sections so I wouldn't rush anything or accidentally misalign the layers. Once glue touches the wood, you've only got a short window to make adjustments before it starts to tack up. You can see me constantly shifting pieces around in tiny amounts to make sure the edges sit flush with all the corners and it stays square. Small misalignments might not seem like a big deal now, but they become real noticeable once the whole structure is put together. The glue squeezing out along the seams is actually a good sign. It means that the glue is spreading evenly between the surfaces. Even though it looks messy now, I'm trying my best to clean it up with my knife and with a paper towel. It wasn't the most elegant method, but the wood glue set fairly quickly, so I really only had to hold them together for about 5 minutes per part. It also didn't help that the 3D printed jig pieces themselves weren't very consistent. I basically just printed a few random box shapes with the actual part extruded from them. Because of that, one corner might have a 1/2 inch thick wall, while another corner may have a 1/4 inch thick wall. When I tried clamping everything together in the vise, those uneven dimensions caused the whole assembly to shift from one side to the other, causing the frame or the subcomponents to be misaligned. At that point, I didn't feel like reprinting the jigs, so I improvised. I ended up wedging pieces of scrap wood against the vise of the clamp and everything together. Not gonna lie, it was a pretty ghetto setup, but it got the job done and applied the pressure exactly where I needed it most, which was along the sides of the frame and the corners. In hindsight, I probably should have just taken the time to redesign and reprint the parts, as it only would have taken another 30 to 40 minutes in total to do. However, the inconsistencies in size for the jig parts weren't too terrible, and since the scrap pieces I had lying around pretty much perfectly fit what I needed them for, I just decided to roll with it. If you're enjoying the build so far, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. If you're not enjoying it, you can still leave a comment. I probably could use the feedback, to be honest. I'm still pretty new to this whole CNC and woodworking thing, so there's a pretty good chance I'm doing at least a few things the hard way. Honestly, half this project has just been me trying to figure things out as I go and hoping a part doesn't snap or I permanently damage something and have to redo it. Now that everything's glued up and clamped together, there's not much left to do but wait for it to cure. While that's setting, I realized I still need a few supplies for the finishing stage, mainly just some brushes for staining. It's a cold but sunny day, which makes it a perfect excuse to take out the Subaru, so I'm gonna go to Home Depot to grab some supplies. I let the glue dry for about 3 days. It probably would have been fine after 24 hours, but I had some personal stuff come up, and not gonna lie, I kind of forgot about it for a bit. After taking it out of the jig, I was really happy with how everything felt once it was all put together. I was still being pretty gentle with it, but with some light testing, the bonds felt strong, so I wasn't too worried about it falling apart just from looking at it the wrong way. At this point, it was time for some final touch-ups before staining. Most of that just meant going around the piece and cleaning out any leftover glue that squeezed through, and just one more round of sanding. Sanding the joint between the two halves of the lighthouse was honestly pretty nerve-wracking. I wasn't exactly sure how much pressure the bonds could handle, and if I broke it, it would be a huge pain to try to glue everything back together. What ended up working pretty well was folding a paper towel and placing it underneath the piece. Since the lighthouse doesn't sit perfectly flush against the table, the paper towel gave just enough support that if I pushed too hard, there was at least a little bit of give and it wouldn't just snap. Now that the last of the touch-up and sanding is over, we can begin the staining process. Before committing to a stain color, I wanted to run a few quick tests on some scrap pieces of wood. Different woods can react unexpectedly to certain stains, and I wanted to make sure it would come out the way I envisioned it, as changing the stain or undoing the stain would be a massive headache, and I would basically just have to remake all the parts again. After letting the samples dry for a few hours, I got some feedback from my family to see which one they thought looked the best. In the end, I decided to play it pretty safe and go with the classic natural wood stain. It keeps the look clean and lets the wood speak for itself. With the stain finally picked out and the piece ready, it was time to commit to my decision and stain it. One of the most satisfying parts of any woodworking project is watching the stain hit the wood for the first time. As soon as it soaks in, all of the grain, color, natural characters of the wood suddenly come to life. Each of the woods in this build react a little bit differently to the stain. The walnut deepens into a really rich dark brown, while the maple stays much lighter and helps create that contrast throughout the piece. The bloodwood already has a strong natural color, but the finish help brings out some of the subtle grain patterns. When applying the stain, the main goal is to keep it even and avoid letting it pool in certain areas. I'm just brushing it on and letting it soak into the surfaces, and then wiping away any excess so that it evenly dries consistently. Luckily, nothing major happened except for one tiny little detail I somehow completely forgot about: hanging it on the wall. I realized that I didn't have any mounting holes for it, and it's pretty frustrating being right at the finish line after I stained the piece. Drilling into the frame at this point is very risky since of how thin the wood is, and I didn't want to split it. As I finished up the staining and set the piece aside to dry, I started thinking about how I was going to hang it. Everything about the build was coming together really well, except for that one small little oversight. I did come up with a solution that used a few 3D printed parts to hang the piece, but I decided to let my grandparents choose what they wanted to do with it before I committed to anything. After giving to them, they absolutely loved it, and they actually came up with a few really clever solutions that fit the theme perfectly. They looped a rope around the top of the frame so it works as both as a decorative element and as a way to hang it to the wall. So unfortunately, in the excitement of me giving them their gift, I forgot to get any footage of them unwrapping it or of it hanging on the wall. So here's the final version of it in my workshop and a picture that my grandparents sent me of it hanging. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time.